Hello and thanks for visiting our website, Rebuilder in a Box. Today we're going to learn how to rebuild the CS alternator, popular on GM from the middle of 86 through 93. First, to take the pulley off, we have a 1/2 inch impact 15/16 socket. You can wrap a rag around the pulley to hold on to it if you want to. I have gloves on, so I'm not going to. You see the nut, which factory doesn't install a lock washer. We're going to install a lock washer. The pulley comes off, it's hollow. Then a spacer, fan, and a spacer underneath the fan. Then you'll see the 3 Torx head bolts. Remove those. 1/4 inch 6-sided socket works great. If the bolts don't want to come out from rust, corrosion, or whatever, turn the alternator upside down and fill these holes up with rust bust. Also, you can tap on them with a hammer to help loosen things up a bit. Then we're going to get it apart. Sometimes you might have to take a screwdriver and tap on the top. Then we're going to set the rotor in a vise. Open the jaws up far enough so that the rotor goes down in, but the plate sits on it. We're going to apply some sort of rust bust around the shaft area where it contacts the bearing. You can use PB Blaster, liquid wrench, preferably not WD-40, but you might actually get that to work for you. Then we're going to get a ordinary 2x4, 2x3, place it on top of it, and smack it to get the shaft out. So now we have the shaft out of the bearing, and there's a spacer that goes next to the rotor. Mark this with a paint stick or put a piece of masking tape on it, or label it in some fashion so that you don't get it confused with the outer spacer, which in this case is thicker, but it depends on which exact version that you're working on. Some of the solders and stuff, the inner one or the smaller one may be thicker. Now we're placing the rotor in a vise carefully so that you don't cause any damage to the plastic fan. Some are metal, some are plastic. The reason we're putting this in the vise is we're going to take the rear bearing off, and what you use is a 1/4 inch by 6 extension, and you hold it sideways and then tap it off. Now that we have the rear bearing off, take sandpaper or Scotch-Brite and polish up the 2 slip ring halves. Now looking at the back half of the alternator, we want to take the internal plastic baffle out, and what we have to do is remove the 3 dowel pins that hold it in. You can see the one there. Just take a center punch and drive that down through, and if you look, you'll notice the other one is here and here. So drive those 3 pieces out. Then take a screwdriver, a small screwdriver, and get under the edge of this rectifier cover and pry it up and out. What we need to do is disconnect the stator leads from the rectifier. The rectifier is back in here and the stator lead's coming up. We don't care if we damage the rectifier because we're going to replace the rectifier. But the stator leads, the wires coming up from the windings, we want to maintain as much of those as possible. This one has not been soldered, it's been welded. So we want to remove just the very top of the weld, because you can see this split area right here, the weld doesn't go down that far. The weld only goes down to where the screwdriver is right now. So what we're going to do is take a pair of side cuts and cut just the uppermost portion of it off. It's going to require some force, but just take the very top of it off. There you can see they've been removed, and as much of the wire, the greatest length of the wire is still maintained. You lost maybe a 16th to a 32nd on the length of this wire, and that's nothing to worry about. Some of them, like this one here, especially if they've been rebuilt before, will be soldered on. And what you want to do is get a 200-watt soldering gun and heat them up, and then either pry that apart or get a pair of needle nose pliers and pull up on it when you see the solder start to melt. Now we need to get the stator out of the rear plate. Stick your fingers underneath the stator and tap down. And the baffle pretty much falls right out. We will not be reinstalling this. And the reason is diodes have come a long way since when this was designed in it. The avalanche diode, when it was first designed, when it came out in the late 80s, was a thin piece of wafer, and they were very, very sensitive, and this created additional airflow to help it last a little longer. It didn't work very well. The rectifiers that we have today are way more advanced in as far as the way the diodes are manufactured and the amount of heat that they can withstand. So this baffle is just going to do nothing but get in your way and give you headaches, and there's no reason to put it back in. So we're ready to pull the components out now. What we have here is the rectifier, the voltage regulator, and the brush holder assembly. Take these three E5 Torx heads out, and this right here is a 5/16. Then there's either a plastic or a metal type outer race for the rear bearing. It more or less comes right out too. If you're doing a Saturn, watch out for when you put it back in, you'll have to note the keyway to line up. And in some models for the rear outer bearing race have a metal piece. It kind of resembles shim stock out of a lathe or something. Doesn't really matter. They both work the same. Take them out, clean them up, and then put them back in. And this is the first time where Delco Remy actually started screwing with the aftermarket. They put out technical bulletins that the CS alternator was non-rebuildable, and this is why. It's really not that hard to get this bearing out. It presents a small challenge. You can see, you don't really see the edge of this 203 bearing. The plate has been cold rolled a lip all the way around. Up in here you can see it better. And what we're going to do is take a chisel, a flat chisel, and sharpen it up so it's pretty sharp. And so you take the front plate, put it in a vise, and in an ordinary flat chisel, sharpened up, and I'm just going to go around, and there's about a 32nd of an inch of a lip, and it's real thin. So it comes right off, and you don't really have to get 100% of it off, just get 75% of it off. Then we want to get the bearing, finish getting the bearing out of the front plate. So what we're going to do is take the pulley and set it with the cup side up, set the rear plate on it, then get a 1/2 inch extension and pound down. To put your new bearing in there, you can put this in the oven, bake it at 350 for about 20 minutes, or you can take a propane torch and heat that up a little bit. Or if you want to, you can be pressed in cold. And if you're putting it in cold, you want to make sure that it doesn't fall in. If it's hot, you know it's going to fall in. Take and put a little bit of red Loctite all around the outside of the new bearing before you drop it in there. Then we're going to give you a bearing retainer to be inserted like that. This is similar to the old school Chrysler alternator. Just pushes, you just spread these out a little bit and push it on, and you want to make sure that this lip clips to the other side. Here it is installed from the other side, and you can see that the lip is down over the edge of the plate, so the bearing can't go anywhere. Putting the rear bearing on, we have a 3/8 socket. Set the bearing on there as straight as you can. Set the socket on the center race and tap down carefully. Once it becomes flush on the top, stop right there. Don't go far enough to where the bearing contacts the slip ring. Leave a gap in it about like that. Putting the rear plate back together, we installed the plastic tolerance ring or metal tolerance ring, whichever you have. Put a thin layer of oil on that to assist the bearing's ability to expand and contract. Lay the rectifier in. You'll notice the heat transfer grease on the bottom, of course. There's 3 holes that hold this thing down. An E5 screw, an E5 screw, and the battery post. The regulator is going to go on here later. So first, put in the 2 E5s and tighten those down right there and there. Looking at the regulator, we're going to lay this down so that the opening is off to the right, and we're going to notice this pin right here because that's what the brush holder fastens to. When you're looking at the brush holder, you'll notice this part here looks like a spade. That has to go on to this. And you want to do it so that the bolts line up, the bolt holes line up, and it'll look like that. This comes out the bottom, and that's going to go through the hole in the rear plate. So take a pair of needle nose pliers or a screwdriver and push that on there. Then we're going to lay that assembly down in like that, and you want the brush pin to come up through the hole in the back. The battery post should be cleaned very well. Do the best job you can cleaning that up on this surface here. That's a contact area. Then put the insulator on, and it goes through this hole right here, coming up through the bottom. Then you put this nut on the top. Also, the underside of the brush holder ground bolt has to be cleaned, and put a thin layer of either dielectric grease or white lithium grease before you put it down through that hole and bolt it in. Pay attention to the brush wire. It should be laying down in a flat position. The two fingers on the fitting on the rectifier have to be folded around the tang that comes up from the voltage regulator. Then we need to get a 200-watt soldering gun and melt a very small amount of solder down in there. The factory doesn't do it, but we recommend that you do also melt a little bit of solder down in that joint where the brush holder pressed onto the voltage regulator. Inspect the stator very closely for any signs of heat or any signs of some sort of meltdown. The biggest thing that goes wrong with the CS alternator, a lot of people realize, is the rear bearing. And when that rear bearing goes, it allows the rotor to drag on the inside. So you have to look at the metal laminations on the inside of the stator very closely, especially if your rear bearing was disintegrated. One of the things that we're inspecting is the condition of the metal laminations. You can see that these are stacks going left to right of metal piled on top of each other and press fitted together. If your bearing was bad and these have been scraped up or ruined, you can tolerate a little, but if they're really gouged out bad, then it's not recommendable to reuse the stator, because a lot of times what will happen is those laminations will get pushed over and they'll slice into the windings. So if you take an ohm meter and any of these windings are touching ground, then you know you have a problem. But if you're kind of wondering if you have a problem or not, and you take an ohm meter and all three of these leads are insulated from the ground, then should be okay. So what we did to prepare the stator was we took some sandpaper and a wire toothbrush and cleaned up these leads in this area up in here extremely well. So we're ready to put the stator down in there. You'll see the three leads and the three openings on the rectifier. Just set it in there. Then we're going to take and push the stator lead back as far as we can into the rectifier leads. Take a pair of needle nose pliers and squeeze them shut. They don't have to be clear to the top, flush, because the rectifier leads can come down a little bit, but as long as you have about 50% of the height there, just go ahead and crimp it together. Then we're going to take a pair of channel locks, small pair of channel locks, and flatten them out so that you get really good contact. take a 200-watt soldering iron and melt some solder down in the top so that it melts in real good. You know you've done a good job. You might see a little bit of it coming out the bottom of the rectifier. When the solder goes all the way through and you've heated it up evenly, you'll see a little bit of solder coming out the very bottom, and that's when it's time to stop putting solder in it. You don't want to get too much solder in that area. We needed to do a really nice job with Scotch-Brite or some fine sandpaper cleaning up the shaft so that we can get it back together easily. And here's the first spacer that goes on. There's our yellow paint marks. So we put that on first. Then we need to take a small amount of red Loctite and put it around the diameter of the shaft, right in that area there. As we're putting the bearing back on the shaft, you want to try not to hit it with a hammer. Squeeze it back on with your fingers and the palms of your hands. Then we're going to put on the outer spacer, the fan, the thick pulley spacer, and the pulley. And even though the factory doesn't, we want to use a lock washer. Then we're going to set it down on the rotor. Get it in the position you want it. There's 3 different positions. And tap it down. Put the bolts in. And tighten up the bolts. Don't pull the pin until you double check like a mock fit on the car to make sure that you have the position set right. Then after you know that your plug-in is in the right place and your mounting bracket is in the right place, go ahead and just pull the pin out. Then all it's left to do is simply put the rectifier cover back on. It just sets on there. If the pins got destroyed as you were removing this, take some caulking or some RTV and just go over the edges with it, just enough to hold it down. There's no stress on